welcome to your real estate journey, expert tips for buyers and sellers. I'm Dolly Lopez, your realtor and real estate coach in the state of Florida and Kentucky. And today I have Valerie with me, one of the attorneys at VPP Law Firm, very highly recommended by me and all my team, and by a lot of people. So welcome, Valerie. How are you?
I am great, Dolly. Super excited to be here today to talk about our favorite subject, real estate.
Yep, I love it. Well, that's all I talk about. And people laugh at me. You don't talk about anything else? Well, other than real estate, I talk a little bit about my kids, family, and real estate. That's it.
Yeah.
Anyways, so today we're going to talk about seller's disclosures and why is it important. So can you give me a rundown of why it's important having seller's disclosures? And what is a seller disclosure? Let's start with that.
Yeah. So a seller disclosure is usually going to be a form that's going to be provided by your realtor, and it's going to be a list of just different questions related to the property itself, right? So mostly it's going to ask you about the water system, whether the water is septic tank or whether it's in city water. It's also going to ask you if there's been any claims done to the property, if there's any damage to the property. It also talks about termites. It also talks about the roof, or there's any damage to the roof. And these are just common questions that a seller will know about their property and that a buyer is going to inquire about. Now, as to this form itself, Florida law is not required, or Florida law does not require a seller to fill this form out. But here's the caveat. Although they're not forced to fill this out and give it to the buyer, they are, as sellers, by law, forced to disclose any issue with the home that may affect its value. So, for instance, if the property, let's say for some reason or another, when water formed, when it rains, it floods, the property floods. That is a very important information that the buyer, by law, has to know and must be disclosed by the seller to the buyer because it affects the value of the property. If we have a property that continuously floods, that's something that is going to significantly affect the value of the property. So although Florida law doesn't require these forms to be filled out by the sellers, Florida law does require all this information that's in here, does require the seller to divulge that information to the buyer. So that's something that you should know. And if you have an experienced realtor working on your side, I can guarantee you that realtor is going to make you fill out this form because it only protects you. So it's very important that sellers know, although not required, it's very, very highly recommended that you do fill this out and you produce it to your buyers.
I always find it interesting when we don't have to legally fill out the form, but yet we have to disclose the information. Correct. So every time that I meet with a seller, I do ask them that this needs to be filled out. And if you don't know the answer, there's a spot right there. It says, I do not know. And that's okay.
That's okay.
You don't have to know everything. And when in doubt, you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't have to say yes or no, but please do fill this out. It only protects you because basically what it does to a buyer is that you don't know if there's a plumbing issue. Now it's their due diligence to hire a plumber if they wanted to know more details.
Mm-hmm.
If there is an issue with the electric, then you don't know.
Yeah.
And they would have to do more of their due diligence.
Correct.
So once again, fill it out. It's extremely important because once again, you can be sued over anything. And let me ask Valerie. So I had this client who purchased a property. Whenever 2 or 3 weeks after closing, they had an issue with their AC.
Mm-hmm.
Then the HVAC person came and they found that underneath of the HVAC system, it had a little bucket
Mm-hmm.
where the water would drip. So whenever they call me, and whenever we go back to the seller's disclosures, they said that there was no issues with the HVAC system. So my question comes into play, like, how did the bucket get there?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the seller, this seller knew, and they lied or they omitted the information because they didn't say I don't know, but they said no. There's no. There have never been any problems with the HVAC system. So, what would be the buyer's right under these circumstances?
So the buyer will have 5 years from the date that they found out of the issue. So in your example, they found out of the AC issue when the HVAC expert came and let them know, hey, here is the issue, and there's a bowl that's, collecting the water. So right then and there, from 5 years from that date is when the buyer has to sue the seller for not disclosing important information and information that affects the value of the property. Because like we all know, ACs can be very expensive to replace. And especially if we have to replace the whole thing, the inside unit and the outside unit. So that directly affects the value of the property. And the seller, we know, knew of the issue because there was a bucket that was collecting water. I mean, who put that there? A ghost? No, the seller put it there. So that's something that we need to know as buyers, and we also need to know as sellers. So if there's any issue at all that you remotely believe that could affect the value of the property, or you know of an issue of the property because it's your property, you're going to know, disclose that information for the buyer. Get ahead of it. Don't cause a legal issue that at the end of the day can cost you more money. Because if the buyer does have to sue you for not disclosing information and the buyer wins in the lawsuit, now not only are you going to be paying to fix whatever issue may be, from your example, it'd be the AC, but now you're also going to be paying for the cost and for the attorney's costs that the buyer incurred. And court costs and attorney's costs are never cheap. So it's always going to be better to get ahead of the situation than to have to pay almost double the amount just because you didn't disclose it.
I completely agree, because the buyers might say, you know what about, it would be more expensive to hire attorneys to represent me in this transaction. But at the end of the day, if they win the case, they really don't have to pay, because the other party would have to pay. And that's agreed upon themselves within the sales contract. Right?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I'm already in there.
Before we finish, I wanted to talk about haunted houses.
Yes.
And paranormal activity. So those have to be disclosed to a seller. Do they have to disclose it to the new buyer as they're buying the property here in Florida?
So Florida law does not require a seller to have to disclose any paranormal activity, any murders that occurred in the house, any suicidal issues that occurred in the house. Any of that information, that's not required to disclose because it doesn't lower the value of the property. Remember, the property itself has its own value. What occurs inside of the property, that's separate and apart, and there is no issue as to value when it comes to that. So no, sellers, don't worry if a murder is committed in there, or maybe a suicide happens in there, or maybe you believe there's a ghost in there. All of that information is not required to be disclosed by the seller to the buyer.
Now, the buyer might think differently. They might disagree with the statement, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really impact the value of the property. Right. Now, the neighbor would come back out and say, hey, there was a murder in the property. Yeah. And that might change your mind. But ultimately, it doesn't affect the price of the value of the property. Therefore, it does not have to be disclosed. So, Valerie, thank you so much. You guys that are watching on your in your houses, please make sure you follow our page, comment. If you want us to cover any other subjects, please comment them below, and we'll love to hear your opinions and thoughts on this topic in particular. But then if you want other topics for us to disclose and talk about. So I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.